The sun came up hard over Fort Davidson that July morning, the way it always did in the Arizona desert. No warning, no mercy, just sudden white heat pressing down on everything below it. By 6:30, the temperature was already pushing 90. By noon, the firing range would shimmer like the surface of a dream. Fort Davidson was not the kind of installation that appeared on tourist maps or congressional briefing packets. It existed in the quiet space between official record and operational necessity, a place where the Army sent its best, its most serious, its most secretive. The men and women who walked those grounds understood, without being told, that the work done here would never be celebrated in public. That was the point. Claire Mercer understood that better than most. She was 28 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, with brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it looked like it had always been that way. Her uniform was immaculate. Her posture was correct. Her expression, when anyone bothered to look at it, was the kind of neutral that communicated nothing. Not boredom, not ambition, not the faintest trace of interior life. She was a logistics specialist, grade E5, assigned to inventory control and equipment management. She had held that position at Fort Davidson for 3 years. In those 3 years, no one had complained about her work. No one had praised it either. She existed in the administrative middle ground, competent enough to avoid notice, unremarkable enough to avoid scrutiny. She was, in every measurable way, invisible. That was exactly what she had been trained to be. On this particular Tuesday morning, Claire was moving through the Armory's eastern corridor, clipboard in hand, checking serial numbers against her inventory manifest with practiced efficiency. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed at a frequency that most people found irritating after a few minutes. Claire had stopped noticing it years ago. She moved past racks of M4A1 carbines, past cases of .556 ammunition stacked in precise columns, past shelving units holding optics and suppressors, and cleaning kits in their designated positions. Then she reached the older section. The M24 sniper rifle sat on its mount the way a piece of history sits in a museum, present, but somehow belonging to a different time. The weapon was a bolt-action precision rifle, chambered in 7.62 NATO, built on a Remington 700 action, with a heavy barrel and a stock designed for the kind of shooting that happened at distances where the human eye could barely distinguish a target from the surrounding landscape. It had been the Army's primary sniper system for decades before newer platforms arrived. Some units still used it. Some instructors still swore by it. Claire set her clipboard down on the nearest shelf. She reached out and lifted the M24 from its mount with both hands, the way you might lift something you had carried for a long time and hadn't held in a while. Her left hand found the forend naturally. Her right hand settled around the grip without searching for it. She brought the rifle up to her shoulder in a single fluid motion, her cheek dropping to the stock, her eye aligning with the scope mounting rail, even though no scope was currently attached. She held that position for 3 full seconds, still, balanced, completely at ease. It was the kind of stillness that doesn't come from practice. It comes from memory. Remarkable piece of equipment, isn't it? The voice came from behind her, measured and unhurried, carrying the quiet authority of a man who had spent 4 decades never needing to raise it. Claire lowered the rifle in one controlled motion and turned to find Colonel Edward Walsh watching her from the corridor entrance. He was 62 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes the color of old slate. The 3 stars on his collar represented not just rank, but a lifetime of decisions made in places that didn't appear on any map. He wore his uniform the way men of his generation wore everything, as if it were a second skin, earned rather than issued. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something that confirms a suspicion he has been carrying for a long time. "Yes, sir," Claire said, just completing the inventory. Walsh moved into the corridor, his hands clasped behind his back. He studied the M24 with an expression that wasn't quite nostalgia and wasn't quite calculation. something between the two. In 1989, he said, we had a modified version of that system operating in conditions that would have made most instructors laugh. Sub-zero temperatures, wind gusting to 30 miles an hour, and targets that were moving and armed and not interested in waiting around. He paused. The shooter using it never missed. Not once. 7 shots, 7 confirmed kills. From a position that, technically speaking, should not have been possible. Claire placed the M24 carefully back on its mount. Impressive marksmanship, sir. Walsh looked at her steadily. Yes, he said, it was. He left without another word. Claire picked up her clipboard and returned to her inventory. Outside, the day was gathering itself for the Falcon Strike competition, the annual marksmanship event that brought elite sniper teams from across the Army to Fort Davidson for 3 days of qualification trials, advanced scenarios, and the kind of professional rivalry that men who spent their careers behind precision rifles took very seriously. The range complex was already busy with preparation. Equipment was being staged, targets calibrated, electronic scoring systems tested and retested. Master Sergeant Frank Kellner was at the center of all of it. He was 44 years old, 6'2", built like something that had been assembled for the specific purpose of being difficult to move. His nickname was Iron, and he had earned it the way nicknames are earned at that level. Not by asking for it, but by being exactly what it described. 3 combat deployments, 15 years training the Army's best marksmen, and a voice that carried across a firing range like a rifle shot. He was currently directing his team through preliminary zeroing drills with the focused intensity of a man for whom second place was a personal insult. Cooper, he said, stopping behind a young sergeant who had just fired a 3-round group that was technically acceptable by most standards. What is that? Cooper studied his target. Tight group, Sergeant. 3 rounds, inside 2 inches at... I didn't ask what it was geometrically. I asked what it was. Kellner's voice was entirely without heat, which somehow made it worse. That is a shooter who is compensating for a wind he measured 4 minutes ago instead of the wind that exists right now. That is a shooter who is in love with his last shot instead of focused on his next one. He stepped back. Reset. Again. Claire passed the range perimeter on her way to the administrative building, carrying updated manifests for the competition equipment. Kellner's gaze crossed her path for approximately half a second before moving on, the way a man's eyes move past furniture in a room he knows well. She was part of the landscape, unremarkable, expected. That was fine. That was the job. Inside the administrative building, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Harrow was waiting. He was 58 years old, lean, with the kind of angular face that looked like it had been cut rather than grown. He had spent 30 years in military intelligence, and it showed in the way he occupied a room, always slightly to one side of center, always with a clear line of sight to the entrance, always watching something that wasn't the thing he appeared to be watching. He held a manila folder in his left hand, and when Claire entered the corridor, he turned toward her with the unhurried precision of a man who had been expecting her. Specialist Mercer. Not a greeting, a statement of identification. Sir, Claire stopped, turned to face him with correct military bearing. You accessed the secondary logistics server at 21:40 hours last Thursday. Still not a question. After your duty day had ended. Yes, sir. The quarterly audit report for Phase 3 equipment had a discrepancy in the serial number range for the 7.62 inventory. I needed to cross-reference against the original receiving manifest, and the primary system was running its scheduled maintenance cycle. Harrow looked at her for 4 full seconds without speaking. In interrogation terms, 4 seconds is a long time. The discrepancy, he said finally, was it resolved? Yes, sir. Transcription error on the original intake form. I filed a correction notice. Another pause, shorter this time. Ensure after-hours access is properly logged going forward. Of course, sir. He walked past her without looking back. Claire continued to her workstation, sat down, opened her inventory files, and began typing. Her hands were completely steady, but her mind was running a different calculation entirely. 3 years of careful work, 3 years of building a cover identity so seamlessly ordinary that even the most suspicious eyes in the building had found nothing worth examining. And now, within the space of a single morning, two things had happened that she had not anticipated. Walsh had seen her with the M24 and had spoken about Berlin, and Harrow was paying close attention. Neither fact was catastrophic on its own. Walsh was testing, not accusing. She understood the difference. And Harrow's scrutiny, while sharp, was still circumstantial. The server access had been logged correctly. The explanation was solid. The audit trail would hold. But the margin for error had narrowed. That afternoon, Claire completed her duties with characteristic efficiency. Equipment manifests, ammunition counts, coordination with the range staff on tomorrow's competition requirements. She worked at her station until 1700 hours, then performed her customary 30-minute run along the base perimeter. This was her routine, documented across 3 years of physical fitness records. Nothing unusual about it. At the far eastern edge of the perimeter, where the running path curved behind a maintenance building and provided 3 seconds of visual obstruction from the nearest camera position, she transitioned to a walking pace and retrieved her secondary communications device from the concealed pocket inside her running belt. The device was the size of a thick playing card and contained no identifying information. The satellite uplink was encrypted at a level that made standard military monitoring equipment register only background noise. She typed a brief status report, 4 lines, encoded, and transmitted it. The response came in 90 seconds. She read it once, then she erased it. The Falcon Strike competition had concentrated every senior officer on the base in a single location and a predictable schedule for the next 3 days. Walsh, Harrow, Kellner, and the visiting brass would all be rangeside from 0800 to 1700 hours each day. The administrative sections would be at minimum staffing. The maintenance corridors below the motor pool, corridors that had been removed from the base's current schematics during a 1993 renovation, but never physically sealed, would be entirely unmonitored. The timing was not coincidental. It never was. But something in the transmission had made her pause. Before the status update, her handler had included a 2-line advisory. Secondary system intrusion detected in target database. Origin unknown. 3 weeks prior to your access, treat operational environment as potentially compromised. She ran the eastern stretch of the perimeter twice more, working through the implications methodically. Someone else had accessed the Meridian database before her. Not a maintenance technician, not an authorized administrator. The access pattern was wrong for both. Deliberate, targeted, and careful. Whoever it was had been inside the system long enough to extract substantial technical data before withdrawing cleanly, which meant she was not the only person hunting Project Meridian, and she had no idea who the other hunter was. That night, Fort Davidson quieted by degrees, the competition teams returning to their quarters, the range staff completing their final preparations, the base settling into its nighttime rhythms. Claire performed her evening routine with the same precision that characterized everything she did. She was in bed, with lights out by 21:30, consistent with her documented pattern. She was not asleep. At 22:45, a quiet knock at her door. She was already standing when she opened it. The young corporal outside had the slightly uncertain expression of someone who had been given a message he didn't entirely understand. "Colonel Walsh's compliments, ma'am. He requests you join him on the East Observation Bench at your convenience. He said to tell you, the night shooting conditions are particularly clear this evening." Night shooting conditions. A phrase with no administrative meaning whatsoever. She found Walsh exactly where the corporal had indicated, sitting alone on a wooden bench at the edge of the Eastern Range complex, facing the darkness where the target stood invisible at distance. The desert sky above Fort Davidson was extraordinary. No ambient light for 30 miles in any direction. The stars close enough to seem architectural. Walsh sat with his forearms resting on his knees, his posture that of a man thinking about something he had been carrying for a long time. He didn't turn when she approached. "Sit down, Specialist Mercer." She sat, left appropriate space between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The desert made its sounds. Insects, a distant coyote, the faint mechanical whisper of the range's automated target systems cycling through their overnight maintenance sequence. "In the summer of 1989, Walsh said, I was part of a six-man team conducting an extraction in East Berlin. High-value asset. Soviet physicist defecting with research documentation that both sides wanted very badly." He paused. "The operation was betrayed from inside our own apparatus. We were surrounded before we reached the extraction point. 8 Stasi officers armed, in position. We had nowhere to go." He looked out into the dark range. "Then someone started shooting from a position on the north side of the square. 3rd floor of a building that should have been inaccessible. The stairwell had been sealed. Temperature was -18 Celsius. Wind gusting to 25 miles an hour in unpredictable direction changes." He was quiet for a moment. 7 shots, 7 kills, each one placed with a precision that the conditions should have made impossible. By the time the last one dropped, we were already moving toward the extraction point. We never saw the shooter. We found 7 brass casings in the snow, cooling, and nothing else. Claire looked straight ahead into the dark. "The asset we extracted that night," Walsh continued, "was carrying documentation for a research program called Project Meridian. Originally a joint Soviet-American initiative from 1985, officially terminated by mutual agreement in 1988. Unofficially," he stopped, then said it again, choosing his words with the care of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding their weight. "Some things are too useful to abandon and too dangerous to acknowledge." He turned and looked at her directly for the first time since she had sat down. "I don't know precisely who you are," he said. "I know what the program was called. I know what its operators were designated. And I know that some programs don't end when the paperwork says they do. They get handed down." He held her gaze steadily. "I want you to understand something, Specialist Mercer. Whatever you've come here to find, whatever you believe Project Meridian represents, there are reasons certain things stay locked away. Not because we lack the capability to use them, but because we understand, with absolute clarity, what using them would cost." He stood, straightening his uniform with the unconscious precision of 40 years of military discipline. "Get some sleep," he said. "The competition starts at 0800. He walked back toward the command building, his footsteps quiet on the hard-packed desert ground, until the darkness swallowed him entirely. Claire sat alone on the bench for 3 more minutes. Then she returned to her quarters, secured the door, performed a sweep for surveillance devices, finding none, and knelt beside her footlocker. From beneath the false bottom, wrapped in a cloth that looked like a cleaning rag, she removed a photograph. Small, black and white. A team of 6 operators standing before a helicopter, dated by the equipment and the clothing to the late 1980s. Walsh was there, younger by 30 years, the same steady eyes in a harder face. And at the right edge of the frame, partially turned away, a woman, small build, precise posture, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from practice. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting she had studied for years, 4 lines. Berlin, August 1989. Extraction successful. 7 for 7. Athena, Paladin Generation 0. The program never ended. It was handed down. Claire looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she placed it back beneath the false bottom, closed the footlocker, and lay down in the dark. Tomorrow the competition began, and so did everything else. The Falcon Strike competition began at precisely 0800 hours, with the kind of organized efficiency that elite military units produce when reputation is on the line. 6 teams had arrived from across the Army's Special Operations community. Rangers, Special Forces, 2 dedicated sniper battalions, and a joint unit from Fort Bragg whose members said very little and watched everything. They moved through the staging area with the focused quiet of professionals who understood that the next 3 days would be remembered, evaluated, and discussed in mess halls and briefing rooms for years afterward. Claire was at her assigned station by 0750. The scoring table was positioned 40 yards behind the primary firing line, elevated slightly on a wooden platform that gave her an unobstructed view of the entire range complex. She had 2 electronic tablets, a manual backup ledger, and a direct radio link to each of the 7 target stations, positioned at distances ranging from 300 to 1,000 yards downrange. Her job was to receive hit confirmation data from the electronic scoring sensors, verify it against the manual spotters at each position, and record the results in real time. It was, administratively speaking, a straightforward assignment. It also gave her the best possible vantage point on the entire installation: the range, the command viewing area, the approach roads, the eastern perimeter, and the rear entrance to the Echo Wing Administrative Building, 230 yards to her left. She had requested the assignment herself 6 weeks ago through entirely routine channels. Kellner brought his team to the firing line at 0755. They moved with the compact precision of men who had done this enough times that preparation had become ritual. Each shooter carried his own rifle, personal weapons, not issued equipment, maintained with the kind of obsessive attention that serious marksmen gave to instruments they trusted with their lives. Cooper, the youngest of the team, was 26 years old, with 3 confirmed kills from a deployment in eastern Afghanistan, and the quiet intensity of someone who had learned early that the difference between a good shot and a perfect shot was measured in patience most people never develop. Kellner stopped at the scoring table. Mercer, confirmed sensor calibration on stations 4 through 7. Confirmed this morning at 0630, Sergeant. Wind sensors recalibrated at 0715 after the temperature differential stabilized. Stations 4 through 7 are reading within spec. Kellner looked at her for a moment with the evaluating expression of a man deciding whether a piece of information was useful. Then he nodded once and moved back to his team. The first relay began at 0800. For 2 hours, the range filled with the disciplined rhythm of precision shooting. The sharp crack of a rifle, the brief silence of a round in flight, the electronic confirmation tone from the downrange sensor, the quiet data entry at Claire's station. The visiting teams performed well. Fort Davidson's team performed better. By the time the first relay concluded at 1,000 hours, Kellner's shooters held a 4-point lead over the nearest competitor, with Cooper sitting at the highest individual score in the field. During the intermission, while teams moved to the shade structures for water and brief consultation, Kellner approached the scoring table again, this time without a specific administrative purpose. He stood at the edge of the platform, watching Cooper make notes in a small notebook, and spoke without looking at Claire directly. Wind at Station 5. It's been inconsistent the last 40 minutes. What are you seeing on the sensors? Claire checked her tablet. Station 5 is showing a surface reading of 6 miles per hour from the northwest, but the thermal sensor at mid-height is reading a 3 mile per hour differential with a directional shift of approximately 15 degrees. There's a thermal barrier forming at roughly 4 feet above ground level. The terrain channels heat off the rock formation to the northwest, and it's creating a layered effect in the wind column. Kellner turned and looked at her directly, not the way he had looked at her before, not the quick, evaluative glance that passed over support personnel, the way light passes over furniture. He looked at her the way he looked at his shooters when one of them said something that changed his understanding of a problem. That kind of analysis, he said carefully, is not in the sensor manual. No, Sergeant, it's in the terrain. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he turned without another word and walked back to where Cooper was standing. Claire watched him speak quietly to the younger man, watched Cooper look up, study the downrange landscape, and begin adjusting his scope settings with renewed attention. 40 minutes later, in the most challenging scenario of the morning relay, Cooper fired his final shot in a wind condition that should have pushed it 8 inches off center. It struck the target dead at the geometric middle. The electronic sensor confirmed it before the sound of the shot had finished echoing off the rock formations to the north. The visiting teams looked at the scoreboard. Kellner looked at Claire. She was already entering the score data into her ledger. It was at 11:15 hours, during the equipment transition between the morning and afternoon relays, that Harrow appeared at the scoring table. He was carrying a coffee cup and wearing the expression of a man engaged in entirely casual conversation, which Claire recognized as the most dangerous expression in his repertoire. "Good morning, specialist." "Good morning, sir." He stood beside the table, looking downrange at the target frames being repositioned for the afternoon scenarios. "Your father was in meteorology, wasn't he? You mentioned it once in a briefing. Something about growing up watching weather patterns." Claire did not look up from her tablet. "My father taught physics, sir. He had an interest in atmospheric science as a hobby. Some of it carried over." "Physics teacher," Harrow nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already known. "Which school was that?" "Jefferson High School, outside Columbus. He retired in 2018. "Right." He took a sip of his coffee. "Long career." 23 years in the classroom, sir." Another pause. The kind of pause that was doing a great deal of work beneath its surface. "Good analysis on the thermal barrier," he said finally. "Kellner mentioned it to me. Said it was unusually specific for someone without field experience." He looked at her with the flat, calibrated attention of a man whose professional instrument was the detection of things that did not align. "Funny how some knowledge just follows you around." "I suppose it does, sir." He walked away without hurrying. Claire entered 3 more data points into her ledger. Her handwriting was unchanged. Same pressure, same spacing, same angle. She had been taught to maintain physical composure under interrogative pressure before she was old enough to drive. But she was also running a rapid internal inventory of exactly what Harrow had just done. He had not confronted her. He had not accused her. He had simply placed a question mark next to a detail in her cover story, delicately, professionally, without showing his hand. And somewhere in the Fort Davidson security system, she was now certain, a Level 2 surveillance protocol had just been activated against her identity profile. Every keystroke, every access log, every movement. She had a narrower window than she had calculated. At 15:45, Walsh passed through the scoring area on his way from the viewing platform to the command building. He stopped briefly at her table, ostensibly to check the current standings. "How are we looking, specialist?" "Fort Davidson leads by 6 points, sir. Cooper has the highest individual score in the field by a significant margin." Walsh looked at the scoreboard for a moment. Then, in a voice pitched precisely at the threshold of the ambient range noise, audible to her, inaudible to anyone beyond 2 feet, he said, "Full senior staff review in Echo Wing Administrative Section at 1400 tomorrow. Quarterly systems assessment, running approximately 3 hours." He moved on before she could respond. She did not need to respond. The quarterly systems assessment would place Walsh, Harrow, and every senior technical officer on the base in the Echo Wing Administrative Section from 1400 to approximately 1700 hours. The secure storage corridor would be staffed only by the duty security officer and 1 additional guard at the primary entrance. Standard protocol for administrative review periods, when the assumption was that the presence of senior staff in the adjacent section provided sufficient oversight. The maintenance access tunnels beneath the motor pool had been physically present for 39 years. They had been removed from the base's official infrastructure documentation in 1993, when a renovation project had sealed several connecting passages and updated the facility schematics. But removal from documentation was not the same as removal from reality. The tunnels existed. The junction that ran beneath the eastern section of the motor pool and connected, through a utility shaft added in 1987, to the maintenance substructure of the Echo Wing still existed. She knew this because she had spent 4 months before her assignment to Fort Davidson studying every version of the base infrastructure schematics available in the classified archives, including the 1987 pre-renovation drawings that had been digitized once and never updated. That evening, after the competition had concluded for the day and the teams had returned to their quarters, Claire transmitted a brief status update from the eastern perimeter. Timing confirmed, access route viable, initiating Phase 2 at 14:30 hours the following afternoon. The response was 4 words: confirmed, proceed with caution. She did not sleep easily that night, not from fear. She had moved through fear so many times that it had become something else, a kind of heightened attention that sharpened rather than distracted. What kept her awake was the secondary intrusion in the Meridian database. 3 weeks prior, unknown origin, unknown purpose. Someone else was in the game. And in operational environments, the things you don't know are always more dangerous than the things you do. The following afternoon, at 14:17 hours, Claire walked through the motor pool with a clipboard and a work order for a hydraulic fluid inspection on a transport vehicle in Bay 7. The work order was real. She had generated it herself 2 days earlier through the standard maintenance request system. The duty mechanic glanced at it, pointed her toward the correct bay, and returned to the engine he was rebuilding. She completed the inspection in 11 minutes, documented the results, and moved toward the rear of the maintenance bay. At the far end, past the last row of vehicles, a supply closet stood marked with a faded inventory designation that had not been updated since 1989. Behind a shelf of hydraulic fluid containers, a ventilation access panel showed subtle signs of recent maintenance, the kind of marks that most people would interpret as routine, and that Claire recognized as evidence of someone else having been through this access point within the last month. She stopped, examined the marks more carefully. Recent. Within 3 weeks, possibly less. The dust displacement pattern was consistent with a single entry, carefully executed with an attempt to restore the original appearance. Not perfect, but close enough that only someone looking specifically would notice. The secondary intruder had used this route. She filed that fact into the operational ledger she maintained in her memory and continued through the access panel. The utility tunnel beyond was exactly as the 1987 schematics had described it. 4 feet wide, 6 feet high, concrete construction with conduit bundles running along the left wall. Emergency lighting at 30-foot intervals provided enough illumination to move without additional equipment. The air was cool and dry, the desert heat above unable to penetrate the thermal mass of the concrete and earth. She moved through the tunnel with the careful, measured pace of someone who had trained in confined spaces, until the instinct for silence became involuntary. 10 minutes of careful progress brought her to the vertical shaft, metal rungs embedded in concrete, leading upward 12 feet to a maintenance hatch. The hatch's electronic lock had been upgraded at some point in the last decade, replacing the original mechanical deadbolt with a keypad entry system. From the concealed compartment in her uniform's inner lining, she removed a compact override device, military-grade hardware, smaller than a deck of cards, capable of interfacing with standard keypad systems through algorithmic cycling. She attached it to the panel, initiated the sequence, and waited 90 seconds while it worked through the probability matrix. The lock disengaged with a sound like a held breath being released. Secure storage. A 7 was smaller than she had expected, approximately 400 square feet, climate-controlled, with humidity regulation systems maintaining the kind of stable environment designed for the preservation of sensitive materials over extended periods. The lighting activated automatically when she entered. Not the harsh fluorescent of standard military facilities, but the softer, more precise illumination of a preservation space. At the center of the room, inside a sealed glass containment case with its own independent climate system, sat Project Meridian. The prototype was unremarkable to an uninformed eye. Roughly the size and shape of a large briefcase, constructed in the utilitarian aesthetic of Soviet engineering from the mid-1980s. Functional, dense, without the design sensibility that American technology of the same era tended toward. A pressure vessel at the core, surrounded by a dispersal mechanism of considerable sophistication, connected to a targeting and release system that had clearly been the product of serious scientific work. It looked, in the most honest assessment, like a piece of old equipment that belonged in a museum. Claire understood within 30 seconds that it was nothing of the kind. She moved around the containment case methodically, using the micro camera concealed in her uniform's second button to document the prototype from every angle. The camera captured high-resolution imagery and spectral analysis data simultaneously, a complete technical profile that would allow forensic reconstruction of the device's capabilities without requiring physical access to the prototype itself. It was during this documentation that she found what she had not expected to find. The original Soviet components, the pressure vessel, the core dispersal mechanism, the primary targeting interface, were exactly as the archived technical documentation had described them. Decades old but maintained with extraordinary care. What was not in the archived documentation, what could not have been in any documentation that predated it, were the American components integrated throughout the secondary systems. She leaned closer to the containment case. The integration work was meticulous. Whoever had done this understood both the original Soviet engineering and the American systems being grafted onto it. The date stamps on the American components were visible through the case glass with the camera's magnification function. 2019, 3 separate upgrade cycles, over a period of 9 years. Inside a supposedly dormant classified storage facility, on an active military base, by persons unknown, using components that would have required classified procurement channels. But it was not the hardware modifications that stopped her cold. On the control interface panel, the newest component, installed sometime in the 2019 upgrade cycle, its design aesthetic unmistakably contemporary, a small display screen was visible through the case glass. The screen was in standby mode, showing a status indicator in a single line of text that had apparently been left active during the last maintenance cycle. Target profiles loaded. 14. She photographed it from 3 angles. 14 target profiles, preloaded into the delivery system of a device that could disperse a precisely targeted aerosol agent with accuracy that modern systems had not yet matched. The original Meridian research had been built around the concept of targeted elimination, the ability to affect specific individuals in a defined space without broader environmental contamination. In 1985, that concept had been theoretical. In 2022, with the targeting and dispersal technology integrated into this system over the preceding decade, it was not theoretical at all. Project Meridian had not been preserved as a Cold War artifact. It had been prepared for use, and the 14 profiles loaded into its targeting system were not foreign nationals or enemy combatants. She knew this because the profile format visible through the case glass, the data structure, the identification categories, the geographic parameters, was consistent with domestic targeting protocols, the kind used for operations conducted on American soil. She had 30 seconds remaining in her authorized maintenance window. She exited the secure storage, ensured the door resealed completely, and began moving back toward the maintenance hatch. Her mind was running the implications in parallel with her physical movements, 2 separate processes, both disciplined, both necessary. She was 8 feet from the hatch when she heard footsteps in the corridor beyond the utility closet. She stopped, listened. 2 sets of footsteps, moving with purpose, not patrol rhythm. Coming below, she heard the utility closet door open, heard voices, Harrow's flat, measured tone, and the voice of a security technician, conducting what sounded like a routine check of the ventilation access points. She waited in the shaft for 4 minutes until the voices below withdrew. Then she descended, moved back through the tunnel, and emerged in the motor pool supply closet with her work order still in her hand, and nothing in her posture to suggest anything other than a routine maintenance task completed and documented. She was halfway across the motor pool when she heard the alarm. Not the perimeter breach pattern, not the fire alarm sequence, the security containment alarm, 3 short tones, too long, repeating. Unauthorized access to a classified data system. Not the physical storage, the server. The secondary intruder had moved again. She was almost to the motor pool exit when her radio crackled. Harrow's voice, clipped and controlled, carrying the particular quality of a man whose suspicions had just been confirmed in a way that demanded immediate action. Specialist Mercer, report to Security Conference Room B immediately. This is not a request. She keyed her radio. Copy that, sir. En route. She walked steadily toward the administrative building, the July heat pressing down on the Arizona desert with the same indifferent force it had always applied, the alarm tones cycling through their repeating sequence across the Fort Davidson public address system. And somewhere in the classified server architecture of the Echo Wing, someone she did not know was moving through systems they had no authority to access and leaving traces that were being read, right now, as her footprints. Conference Room B was at the end of the second-floor corridor in the security section. Claire entered to find Harrow standing at the head of the table with 2 documents in his hands and the expression of a man who had been waiting for a specific moment and had just watched it arrive. He looked at her without speaking for 3 full seconds. Then, before he could begin, the door opened again, and Walsh stepped inside. He looked at Harrow, he looked at Claire. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and placed both hands flat on the table with the deliberate calm of a man who had decided something. Before you proceed, Daniel, Walsh said quietly, there are things you need to understand about the situation we are actually in. Harrow stared at him. Sit down, Walsh said, both of you. Outside, the alarm was still cycling. Somewhere on the base, an 8-vehicle convoy had just cleared the outer checkpoint, moving toward Fort Davidson's main gate with a set of authorization codes that had been generated using credentials belonging to a man who had been dead for 4 months. Project Meridian's extraction team had arrived, and the window for stopping them was closing faster than any of them had anticipated. The conference room was small enough that the 4 walls seemed to lean inward when Walsh spoke. Harrow remained standing at the head of the table for a moment longer, a man whose professional instinct was to maintain positional authority in any room he occupied, and then, with the controlled deliberateness of someone making a conscious decision rather than a concession, he sat down. Claire sat across from him. Walsh placed a manila folder on the table between them. He did not open it immediately. The convoy that cleared our outer checkpoint 11 minutes ago, he said, is carrying 8 operators from what is listed in the authorization documentation as SOCOM Extraction Alpha. Their mission parameters describe a routine relocation of sensitive Cold War-era research materials from Fort Davidson to Fort Lyle in Virginia for enhanced security consolidation. He paused. The authorization codes are legitimate. The paperwork is complete. The digital signatures are valid. Harrow looked at the folder. Then what's the problem, sir? The problem, Walsh said, is that the primary authorization code on that transfer order belongs to Colonel James Briggs, who was one of 3 officers designated as custodial authorities for Project Meridian when it was reclassified under its current storage protocol in 1992. He let that sit for a moment. Colonel Briggs died on March 14th of this year. Single vehicle accident on Interstate 81 outside Harrisonburg, Virginia. The investigation concluded mechanical failure. The room was quiet. The other custodial authority was Brigadier General Harold Morrow, retired 2019. He passed away in October of last year. Cardiac event at his home in Scottsdale. Walsh looked at Harrow steadily. 2 deaths in 18 months, both ruled accidental. Both men who held authorization codes for Meridian's transfer protocol. Harrow's expression changed. The interrogator's mask was still in place, but beneath it something had shifted. The recalibration of a man whose threat model had just expanded significantly. You're the 3rd custodial authority. I am. And someone just used Briggs's code. Someone obtained Briggs's code from Briggs, Walsh said. Before or after his accident, I don't know which, and for our purposes tonight, it doesn't matter. He opened the folder. Inside were 2 pages of printed documentation, the transfer order and an accompanying analysis. What matters is that the convoy outside is carrying 8 operators who believe, or are pretending to believe, that they have legitimate authority to remove Meridian from this installation. And if they succeed, that device disappears into a logistics chain that I cannot trace and you cannot follow. And whatever its current deployment configuration represents becomes someone else's operational asset. Harrow looked at Claire for the first time since Walsh had entered the room. His expression was complicated, the residue of 3 years of professional suspicion rearranging itself around a new interpretive framework. Who is she? He said. Not a question directed at her, a question directed at Walsh. Walsh looked at Claire. Claire made the decision in the space of a single breath. The cover was functionally over. Harrow knew it, Walsh knew it, and the convoy outside had compressed the timeline to a point where the operational value of maintaining the fiction was precisely 0. My designation is Mercer, she said. That part is real. I was assigned to verify Meridian's current status and identify who was attempting to access it through unauthorized channels. The secondary server intrusion you detected tonight was not my operation. I don't know who it belongs to. She looked at Walsh. What I found in storage A7 this afternoon changes the mission parameters significantly. Harrow's eyes sharpened. You access the secure storage. 14 target profiles are loaded into Meridian's targeting system, Claire said. Preloaded, ready for deployment. The device has been upgraded 3 times in the last 12 years using American components sourced through classified procurement channels. It is not a preserved artifact. It is a functional, prepared weapon system. And the target profile format is consistent with domestic application. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had preceded it. Harrow sat back in his chair. For the first time in 3 years, Claire saw something in his face that was not calculation or suspicion. It was the expression of a man who had spent his career guarding a door and had just been shown what was on the other side of it. 14 American targets, he said quietly. That is what the loaded profiles indicate. Walsh stood. The movement was unhurried but final, the way a man stands when he has finished considering his options and arrived at a conclusion. We have limited time and fewer resources than I would like. The convoy will reach the main gate security checkpoint in approximately 12 minutes. Standard protocol for classified material transfer requires my physical presence for final authorization. I can use that requirement to delay their access, but I cannot use it indefinitely. Their documentation is legitimate enough to override my objections through proper channels within an hour. He looked at Harrow. I need your security team positioned to control movement without directly opposing the transfer order. Cite the base security alert from the server breach. That gives you legitimate cause to restrict vehicle movement in the interior without challenging their authorization. Harrow nodded once, already reaching for his radio. Kellner, Walsh continued. I'll call him now, Harrow said. Tell him it's a readiness evaluation. Night exercise. I want his team positioned at the junction approaches to the Echo Wing with training parameters that put them exactly where I need them. Walsh turned to Claire. What do you need? Access to secure storage A7 before the convoy reaches it, Claire said. 15 minutes. And I need the name of whoever authorized this transfer from above the custodial level. Briggs's code got them through the documentation layer, but someone with access to the classified procurement system upgraded Meridian 3 times over 12 years. That person is still operational. Walsh reached into his jacket pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. Undersecretary Garrett Hollis, National Security Council Advisory Staff. I've had the procurement irregularities traced for the past 6 weeks. The upgrade authorizations route back to a shell contractor that Hollis established in 2008. His expression carried the weight of a man describing a betrayal he had spent months confirming and still found difficult to accept. He's been running Meridian as a private asset inside a classified program. The buyers are not a foreign government. They are a private security consortium with contracts in 4 active conflict zones. The sale price, based on the documentation I've been able to reconstruct, is in the range of $340 million. Harrow made a sound that was not quite a word. Not ideology, Claire said. Not geopolitics. No, Walsh said, just money. The oldest reason there is. He moved toward the door. I'll go to the main gate. Daniel, get Kellner moving. Mercer, whatever you're going to do in that storage room, do it quickly and do it cleanly. He paused at the threshold, and for a moment he looked his age in a way that he almost never did. Not old exactly, but marked by time in a way that only became visible when the weight being carried was this specific. This base has kept that device secure for 30 years. We are not going to lose it tonight. He left. Harrow was already on his radio. Claire moved out of the conference room and down the corridor at a pace that was one deliberate step below urgent. She went down the rear stairwell, through the service corridor connecting the administrative section to the maintenance infrastructure, and into the tunnel access beneath the motor pool for the second time in 3 hours. She moved faster now, the margin for careful pacing consumed by the clock. Up the shaft, override device on the keypad, 90 seconds that felt like a geological event. The lock released. Inside secure storage. A7, the climate control hummed its quiet note, and the containment case held Meridian exactly as she had left it. Claire worked with the compressed efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this specific task enough times that her hands could complete it while her mind ran the parallel calculations. From the inner lining of her uniform, she removed a transponder the size and weight of a coat button, passive tracking technology, undetectable by standard scanning equipment, capable of transmitting location data through any electronic shielding short of a military-grade Faraday enclosure. She attached it to the internal frame of the containment case at the junction of 2 support struts, where it would be invisible to visual inspection and protected from incidental contact. She used 3 additional minutes to document the 14 target profiles in detail, not just the format confirmation she had captured earlier, but the specific data fields visible through the case glass, the geographic parameters, the identification categories. Whatever happened tonight, this information needed to exist somewhere outside this room. She transmitted the documentation package through her communications device on the encrypted uplink. 45 seconds for the transmission to complete. Confirmation received. Then she sealed everything, restored the storage room to its exact prior condition, and moved back toward the shaft. She was through the motor pool and crossing toward the Echo Wing exterior when Walsh's voice came through her radio. Tight. Urgent. Mercer, Vance's team has split. 4 men are moving toward the Echo Wing service entrance. The other 4 are heading for the East Perimeter Road with a transport vehicle. They're running a distraction protocol. The 4 at the entrance are a feint. The vehicle on the Perimeter Road is the actual extraction point. Claire processed this in 2 seconds. Vance was good, better than she had anticipated. He had assessed the situation at the main gate, understood that direct access through the front was compromised, and restructured his operation into a split approach without breaking stride. The transport vehicle on the perimeter road would reach the east access gate in approximately 4 minutes. If it cleared that gate, with Meridian loaded through the service entrance by the 4-man feint team, while security focused on the perimeter vehicle, the containment case would be in transit before anyone could mount a legitimate intercept. The transponder would track it, but tracking was not the same as stopping. She changed direction. The observation tower on the eastern range was 240 yards from her current position, positioned to give range safety officers an elevated line of sight across the full competition complex. It was unlocked during training hours and not yet secured for the evening. She covered the distance in 90 seconds, moving with the compressed efficiency of someone for whom urgency had always translated into precision rather than speed. The tower was 32 feet high. She took the exterior ladder in 8 seconds. At the top, the observation platform held a mounted spotting scope, 2 folding chairs, and a rifle rack containing a single M24. The range safety officer's backup weapon, loaded, maintained to the same standard as every other piece of equipment at Fort Davidson. The same model, the same weight, the same balance point. She had known it was there. She had inventoried it herself 3 weeks ago, along with every other weapon on the base. She pulled the rifle from the rack and moved to the platform railing. Below, and to the east, the perimeter road was visible as a pale line against the darker desert floor. The transport vehicle, a military LMTV, running without lights in what its driver apparently believed was sufficient darkness, was moving along the road at approximately 30 miles per hour, heading for the east access gate. 847 yards. The night air above Fort Davidson was cool and dry. The thermal activity that had complicated the afternoon competition largely dissipated. Wind from the northwest at 9 miles per hour, consistent and readable. The vehicle was moving perpendicular to her position, which made the lead calculation clean. The target was the front left tire, a shot that would disable without endangering the occupants, that would stop the vehicle without destroying what it might be carrying. Kellner's voice reached her from below, from somewhere at the base of the tower. She had not heard him approach. 847, he said. 9-mile wind from the northwest. Moving target at 30 miles per hour. A pause. Left front tire puts it in the soft shoulder without rollover at that speed. He was giving her the confirmation of his own calculation. Not assistance, not instruction. Confirm. From a man who had spent 15 years knowing the difference, and who was offering her the respect of treating her as an equal. She settled into her position, cheek to stock. The vehicle filled the scope, moving smoothly, the driver unaware of what was above him in the dark. She tracked it for 4 seconds, establishing the rhythm of its movement, reading the minor course corrections as it followed the road's curve. The shot had a 2-second window before the vehicle reached an angle where a tire strike would produce an unpredictable result. She took one breath, let half of it out, found the stillness that had nothing to do with practice and everything to do with 16 years of understanding what she was and what she was for. She fired. The sound rolled across the desert range like a single struck note, clean, final, absolute. Below, the LMTV's front left tire disintegrated. The vehicle pulled hard left, the driver fighting the wheel, the truck sliding to a controlled stop in the soft dirt beside the road, 30 yards short of the access gate. The engine died. The dust settled. No one was hurt. Meridian was not going anywhere. Kellner was quiet for a long moment. Then from the base of the tower he said, "Longer than you've been anything else." He was repeating her own words back to her. Not a question, not a compliment. The acknowledgement of a man who had been right about something for 3 years and had just watched the proof land at 847 yards in the dark. She lowered the rifle, replaced it in the rack with the same care she had given it when she took it down, descended the ladder. When she reached the ground, Kellner was standing with his arms crossed, looking out toward the stopped vehicle where two of his operators were already moving to secure Vance's men. He did not look at her immediately. When he did, his expression carried the specific weight of a man who has spent his professional life measuring capability against performance and has just witnessed something that landed above the top of his scale. In the Echo Wing storage corridor, the four-man feint team had encountered Harrow's security personnel and Kellner's remaining operators simultaneously, a blocking position that left them with no viable continuation. The operation was over on both fronts within the same 60-second window. Harrow's voice came through on the base-wide channel, flat and final. East Perimeter, LMTV is down. 4 personnel secured. East Gate is closed. Echo Wing service entrance is secure. All Extraction Alpha personnel are in custody. Walsh was already moving through the base toward the Echo Wing, his stride unhurried in the way of a man who has received the news he needed and is now attending to the details that follow from it. He found Claire and Kellner outside the tower. He looked at the stopped LMTV on the perimeter road. He looked at Claire. He looked at the observation tower behind her. He did not say anything immediately. He stood the way men of his generation stood when something resolved itself in a way that closed a very long loop, with the quiet weight of completion rather than the noise of victory. "Major Vance," Walsh said finally. "In custody at the East Gate," Harrow confirmed over the radio. "He's not fighting it. Says he wants to talk." "He'll have an opportunity," Walsh said. He turned back to Claire, and for a moment, his expression held something that was not quite professional assessment and not quite personal. Something between the two, in the territory that decades of classified service had carved out of ordinary human feeling. "The transponder. Attached and transmitting," Claire said. "The documentation package was transmitted 40 minutes ago. 14 target profiles, full technical configuration, complete upgrade history. It's in the system." Walsh nodded once. Then he looked out toward the dark desert range, the same direction he had been looking when he sat alone on the bench the night before, in the same posture, carrying the same weight that some men never fully put down. "Get it done," he said. To Claire, to the night, to the 33 years of classified custodianship that had come to this specific moment on this specific desert installation. Then he turned and walked toward the Echo Wing to manage what came next. Claire spent 40 minutes in secure storage. A 7 after that, completing the documentation package with the thoroughness the situation demanded. The full technical profile of Meridian's current configuration. The upgrade history reconstructed from component date stamps. Every piece of information packaged and transmitted through the encrypted uplink to the handler network that would route it to the appropriate oversight authorities. When she finally closed the containment case and walked out of the storage room, Kellner was waiting in the corridor. He fell into step beside her without speaking, the way soldiers walk together when the operation is concluded and there is nothing left that requires words. They reached the exterior and stood at the edge of the maintenance road, looking out over the base. The perimeter floods cast their hard light across the parade ground. The desert sky above was full of stars. "You know what I tell my shooters," Kellner said, "when they want to understand the difference between someone who can hit a target and someone who actually knows what they're doing." She waited. "I tell them it's not about the mechanics. Mechanics can be taught to anyone who's patient enough. It's about judgment." He held her gaze. "Whether to shoot, when to shoot, what it costs to be right, and what it costs to be wrong. Most people who come up through this program, they've got the mechanics. Some of them develop the judgment." He paused. "You already had it." He turned and walked back toward the barracks, his footsteps quiet on the hard-packed desert road, until the darkness absorbed him. Claire stood alone at the edge of the maintenance road. She was 28 years old, and she had been doing this, in one form or another, for 16 years. She had been selected for Project Paladin at an age when most children were worried about grades and weekends, and she had been trained by people who understood that some capabilities, once developed, belonged to something larger than the person who carried them. That was the bargain. She had made it young enough not to fully understand it. She understood it now. 3 days later, Fort Davidson had returned to its operational rhythms. The Falcon Strike competition results had been officially recorded. Fort Davidson's team listed as overall champion, with Cooper holding the individual high score for the third consecutive year. The security alerts from the competition period had been attributed to sensor malfunctions and a server maintenance error. Vance's convoy had departed the installation under Walsh's authority, its mission documentation amended to reflect an administrative delay and a rescheduled transfer pending Joint Chiefs review, language that would keep the Meridian transfer frozen in the authorization system for months, while the evidence chain made its way through the appropriate federal channels. In the officers' dining facility on a Thursday morning, Walsh sat alone at a corner table with his coffee and a folder of routine administrative correspondence. Harrow took the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation, which was, Walsh reflected, entirely in character. "Meridian's been referred upward," Harrow said, sitting with the contained precision of a man who had reorganized his understanding of a situation and was operating from the reorganized version. "The procurement irregularities are being reviewed at a level above this command. I've been told, unofficially, that a senior NSC staff member is the subject of a federal investigation." Walsh nodded slightly. "Mercer has been reassigned," Harrow continued. "Transfer orders arrived this morning. Fort Belvoir, administrative support, effective immediately. File is clean. Nothing in the record that would indicate anything other than a routine reassignment." "Good." Harrow was quiet for a moment. Outside the dining facility windows, the morning training routine was beginning. Runners on the perimeter road, a weapons cleaning detail working in the shade of the armory overhang, Kellner's voice carrying across the parade ground as his team began their morning drills. "She was never what I thought she was," Harrow said. It was not quite an apology and not quite an admission. It was the assessment of a professional acknowledging the limits of his assessment. "No," Walsh said. "She was exactly what she needed to be." Harrow stood, straightened his jacket, and paused before leaving. "Berlin," he said. 1989. The 7 shots." Walsh looked up from his coffee. "That was the beginning of this," Harrow said, not a question. "That was the beginning of the program that produced her," Walsh said. "The connection runs longer than either of us has clearance to fully understand. Some things don't end when they're supposed to. They just change the form they take." Harrow nodded once and left. Walsh returned to his correspondence. Outside, the desert morning was clear and sharp, the temperature already climbing toward the 100-degree mark that July afternoons in Arizona treated as a baseline. On the eastern range, the automated target frames were being positioned for the morning qualification session, and the sound of Kellner's instructions to his team carried across the still air, with the authority of a man who had been permanently altered by something he would never fully explain to anyone. A week later, in a building in Northern Virginia that had no identifying signage and appeared on no organizational chart, Claire sat across a table from Victor Aldridge. He was 74 years old, with the weathered, precise face of a man who had spent 5 decades making careful decisions in environments that punished imprecision, and the particular stillness of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone. He pushed a manila envelope across the table without ceremony. "Hollis was taken into federal custody this morning," he said. 6-count indictment, fraud, conspiracy, unauthorized disclosure of classified materials, and 3 counts related to the procurement chain." He paused. "His legal team will spend the next 2 years trying to move the case into classified proceedings where the details stay buried. They will not succeed." Claire opened the envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper, handwritten, the penmanship of a man who had spent 40 years signing documents whose existence he could never acknowledge. Controlled, deliberate, each letter formed with the unconscious precision of someone for whom discipline had long since stopped being a choice. She read it. "Some victories are measured only by what doesn't happen. The ones who understand that, they're the ones who make it matter. The program continues because it must. So does the work. It was an honor to see it done properly. E.W. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the interior pocket of her jacket. Aldridge watched her with the patient attention of a man who understood what the letter meant to the person reading it, because he had received letters like it himself, from men now long dead, in the years when the Cold War was not history but present tense. Walsh retires at the end of next month, he said. I know. His replacement won't know about Meridian, about Paladin, about any of it. He folded his hands on the table. That's how it works. The knowledge gets narrower as the people who carry it age out, which is why the work you do matters beyond the specific operations. He looked at her steadily. You are the institutional memory now, for the things that can't be written down. Claire was quiet for a moment. Outside the building's single window, Northern Virginia was going about its morning in the specific way of a city that contains multitudes of classified things and shows none of them on its surface. Traffic on the arterial roads, a commercial aircraft on approach to Dulles, the ordinary machinery of a country that had no idea how much of its safety was produced by people whose names appeared in no public record. What's next, she said. Aldridge reached to the side of the table and placed a second folder in front of her, thinner than the first. Preliminary material, not a full briefing package. A verification operation, he said, straightforward by comparison, though I've learned to distrust that word in operational contexts. Claire picked up the folder. The first page contained a location, a military installation in the Pacific Northwest, a preliminary asset profile, and a one-paragraph operational summary written in the specific shorthand of people who communicated sensitive things in language designed to mean nothing to anyone who didn't already know what it meant. She read the summary, then she closed the folder. When do I leave? She said. 48 hours, Aldridge said. The cover is already established. You've been in the system for 6 months. She nodded, stood, placed the folder under her arm. At the door she paused, not turning around. The tunnel access at Fort Davidson, she said. The marks on the ventilation panel. You found them, Aldridge said. His voice carried something that might, in a less controlled man, have been called warmth. You left them deliberately. I've been leaving things for people who come after me for 30 years, he said. It's the only form of mentorship available in this line of work. She left the building and moved into the Northern Virginia morning. She carried the folder and the letter and the 3 years of Fort Davidson and everything that had happened there as simply and efficiently as she carried everything else. Not as weight exactly, but as the accumulated substance of a life given over to the principle that certain lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed, and that the crossing of them must therefore be prevented by whoever has been trained and trusted and positioned to prevent it. She used the first of her 48 hours to find a frame for the photograph of the Berlin team. Walsh, young, at the center, the woman at the edge with her face turned away, the handwriting on the back. She placed it on the shelf above her desk, in the corner of the room where she could see it from anywhere she stood. Then she began preparing for what came next. Some wars never truly ended. Some guardians never ceased their watch. The program had been handed down once already. Someday, she understood, it would be handed down again, to someone younger, someone selected early, someone who would find marks left deliberately on a ventilation panel and understand what they meant. That was the work. That was the bargain. That was enough. The Pacific Northwest was waiting.